topic that I got some feedback that some folks may be struggling with. I think it'll be a good review for all of us, and it's also pertinent to what we're going to be covering tonight. And so I'm going to do a quick review, and then we'll talk about it again in context when we get to that part. So tonight we're going to be talking about advanced styling techniques, and the review topic is going to be props and data passing. I think I may have mentioned this before, but there are a lot of different ways that you can share information between different components in React. And sharing props or passing props, or props is just a short term for properties. So if you're familiar with HTML element, properties on HTML elements, it's the same thing in React and React components. You create properties in exactly the same way. It's part of the tag, the opening tag. And we'll talk a little bit more about how props or properties are passed and how they're handled. But we'll get back to it as well in the context of advanced styling techniques. So tonight, in addition to that review, we're going to cover how to bootstrap. And I'm not going to use that term. It's listed here in the TK, but it's a little confusing because bootstrap is also a module package that we're going to be using. And this bootstrap, it's listed in the module or in the objectives here, has nothing to do with that. But rather, we're going to talk about how to create a React application from scratch using an application called Create React App. And so far, we've been doing it in Code Studio, and we are going to use Code Studio again tonight. Somebody asked in a previous class if I could drop some notes on how to create a React application and modify it using Visual Studio Code. And because they were having issues and challenges with Code Studio. And so I did that, and I dropped that from a GitHub repo that's got some notes in it. It was a little bit early. We're going to talk about it a little more in depth tonight, about how you create a React application that can be deployed and that you can integrate with GitHub. You can actually do that with Code Studio as well. But we're going to talk about how to do it from the command line. Whether it's Windows or Mac, it should be pretty much the same. Also with Linux, I've never done it in Linux because I don't own a Linux machine. But I think the principles are the same. So we'll talk about that, and then next we'll talk about a package called React Strap, and that's related to another package called Bootstrap. We'll talk about how to create stylized React components using React Strap and Bootstrap. And then we'll also talk about how to create stylized components using something called styled components, which is another package or a module. And they're different, but they're similar in that both React Strap and styled components manufacture or create components using React, and we can import the components that they create, and then we can manipulate them, and it allows us to get to starting in an application more quickly. There are positives and negatives to using other another organizations, other companies, or another person's component library. And I'm happy to have that discussion with anybody, but tonight we're mainly going to focus on how to do it, not necessarily why you would or wouldn't. The main benefit is that it's fast, and it allows you to focus on business logic. A lot of people use these things for proof of concept applications. And in other cases, they're just a quick and dirty way to get something off the ground, maybe for internal use. And others actually use them as a foundation for a full-blown production application that millions of people use. Reasons for why you might not want to use a component library range from it not being your code, so you can't control it, the size of it, it's bloated, there might be security issues and other challenges that you can have. But you know, whether or not you will use a component library is largely driven by the environment, the application, and your own personal preference. We've all gone through how to create components using React app from the ground up. What you're going to see tonight are component libraries that create components using the exact same methods that we've learned. So you'll understand how they work behind the scenes, but we'll be able to get to stylizing those components in a much more readable way using these two component libraries. So we'll dive into those tonight as we get going. So just as a reminder, please use Slido for questions that are general in nature. Use Slack. We'll open a thread here that you can use Slack for procedural questions, or if you're having challenges with your environment, we'll ask the TLs to monitor this help thread in Slack. Let's see, we can pin this so you guys will have access to that. And I'll monitor Slido from time to time and be able to dive into questions there. So let's get started first with just a brief review of property passing. And I'm going to go back to a guided project that we did in a previous class about that. I apologize, I didn't take all the notes out of this, so we'll have to skip through those, but the colored bits are the parts we care about. Let me quickly modify, that's the wrong setting. My font so that it's the right, bigger size. It's a little easier for people to read. Okay, so hopefully that's a little easier to read. So in this guided project, if you remember, we created an application that actually had two different components that were composed of other components. One was a simple counter. We have these buttons. When you click on the buttons, it changes the count. And the other was this color picker with these icons. And when you click on the button, it changes the text and the color of the text to match the button that you clicked on. So if you remember that, we used techniques of passing information, parent component down to, oh, by the way, thank you for starting the recording. I forgot to mention that. So thank you, Winnie or James, for whoever started that. So I appreciate it. So we use the technique of passing information from a parent component to a child component so that the parent component can have some control over what the child component does, right? And the main method that we used and that we learned about was properties, otherwise known as props. And so we're just going to kind of go through this application as a review. If you remember, we also learned about importing and exporting. So here in our index, we have what is this? Oh, I named the component super duper app component. That's what the import was. But it's from our app file, and in our app, we have just an app component that's composed of a color picker and a counter that are both in a div. And so let's focus first on the counter. Okay, in our counter component, the main idea here is that we would have 3 buttons as subcomponents, and each of those buttons would have some impact on the state of the counter. Okay. So somebody's asked a question, and I'm happy to field these as we go. The question is, when you define a component function, so if I opened up counter button, for example, you can see that the name here is props. And I think the question was, does it have to be called props? I'm kind of paraphrasing, but if I didn't get that question correct, let me know. But I think that's the, yeah, okay, that's the main question. So this is where I kind of want to step out of React a little bit and focus you guys on some basic principles of JavaScript, because in reality, what's happening when props are being passed, you already understand it, and you understand it intuitively because you use it all the time when you create functions. Okay, so let me give you an example. If I were just to create a function, and this is not a component function, this has nothing to do with React, it's just a function, right? So if I were to create a function, I'm going to give it a, use the function tag, I'm going to give it a name, call it my fancy function, and then I'm going to do something. Okay, and then let's say somewhere else I'm able to call that function, right? So I can call my fancy function. Okay, this is a simple function that does something, and in order for me to call it, I just use its name with parentheses. And you guys all know this is JavaScript, not even 101. It's remedial JavaScript, right? It's just basic create a function and call a function, right? What if I wanted to pass a string into my fancy function and have it print that, right? So instead of do something, I could say do, and I'll use a string literal, and I want to be able to pass it in so that down here I can say pass in a string called a dance, right? So what have I got to do to my function in order to be able to make this work? So I want to call my fancy function, but I want to give it some information. And so what do I have to do over here? Somebody, anybody, it's a real quick answer. Everyone should know. It's kind of silly for me to even ask. Set a parameter, right? That's exactly right. I just need to give the parameter a name. What does the name of the parameter have to be? It's kind of a trick question. What do I have to call the parameter? Banana, anything, whatever you like. Exactly. So I could call it whatever you like. Give it any name that I want, right? And then if I want to access that somewhere down in the function itself, then I just access it using that name, okay? I probably misspelled it, okay? So again, I'm just talking about basic JavaScript, right? So the name of this parameter is just a parameter being passed into a function. And I can call it whatever I want, and it doesn't matter what I call it because whoever's calling the function doesn't need to know that, right? All they're going to do is give me a value. And in the end, the value that they give me is assigned to that parameter as a variable, right? Well, when we look at functional components in React, keep in mind that every component we define is just a function. It's just a function. That's all it is. With props, all we're doing is saying that when somebody calls our function, they're going to pass us some data. We can call this whatever we want. Now, conventionally, it's called props. That's a convention, okay? It makes it easier to talk with other people that are working in React about your application. You know, if you don't have some strange name like banana. But if I wanted to call it banana, I could. It's just that when inside my function, when I reference it, I have to use the name of it, right? Because it's just a parameter. That's a funny video. Yeah, you made me laugh. That's actually, my kids would be impressed because they're constantly trying to make me laugh, and they feel special when they get to do it. Because I'm a tough critic. Anyway, that's a funny video. Anyway, that also probably reveals a little bit about how shallow I can be sometimes. So probably should not have laughed at that. So in any case, you get the point, right? Here's that in my function that is a component, I have a parameter, and I want to access that parameter, okay? Question is, how do we get data to be passed to our function component? Okay, how do we get data to be passed to it? Well, when I look at counter, this is where we talk about component composition, where a parent component uses a child component to make up what the parent component is. So here is the JSX that makes up our parent component of our counter component, okay? And as part of that JSX, we've got a div, and this is similar, very similar to an HTML div. It's got a property in the opening tag. We have an H2. We have a paragraph or a P tag that also has a property. And in this case, the properties are the class names. We have another div. And then down here is where we're using our custom component, okay? But we're using it like a regular tag, but it's a JSX tag. It's very much like an HTML tag. And in that respect, being like an HTML tag, we're able to pass parameters to it, okay? And we can pass any parameter we want. Or we could say, another way to say that is we could say we set parameters on, okay? Whatever parameters we put in the opening tag of our custom component, the way that React works is when it sees a custom component being referenced or used, it's going to call the function that comprises that component. So if we go back to our counter button, we can see that this is a function, right? So here in the counter function, we're referencing counter button as an element or as a component, and in doing that, we're setting these properties on it, and that's going to cause React to call our function that defines the counter button. Now, those properties that we've set here are going to be passed in this object. Okay, so whatever we called it here, I'm going to change it back to props because, again, that helps us remember exactly what it is. We call it props by convention. It actually might be better for us to call it properties. Because for any given instance where counter button is used, the properties that are set in that opening tag are passed as an object. They're collected together and they're passed as an object. So if we were to go back here to counter and look at where we're using counter button, in this instance, we've got two properties. We've got one named number function and another one named button label. And so if we were to look over here at what the properties object looks like, it's going to look like this. Okay, let's suppose that it didn't actually get passed in, but rather we get to define it. Dang it. Oh, we'll get this. Okay. And then okay, so if we go back to counter, we've got these two properties that are being set on it. And over here in our counter button, you know, I'm hand coding an object, and you can see that I can access that object and I can access the properties on that object, right? We don't want to hand code it. We want to allow whoever's using our component to set their own custom properties and pass them in, and then we'll use them as we render or define the component itself, right? But essentially what gets passed in here looks like this. It's just an object that contains properties in it, and the value of those properties, the name of those properties and the value of those properties is determined by what we use in the opening tag when we create the component or when we use it, okay? Yes, I will give you the link to this. And I'm actually, just because this is now not compilable, I'm going to comment that out. But you get the idea, right? So now one thing that might be a little confusing is it's a little, I won't call it an advanced technique, but it's something that you have to kind of wrap your head around. When you think about in JavaScript that, you know, how objects work, one of the key features of JavaScript as a language, and you won't find this in every programming language, but it is this way in JavaScript, is that functions are considered a first-class member of the language. What that means is that functions themselves are objects. Okay, now in other programming languages, that's not true. But in a programming language like JavaScript, where a function is an object, you can treat it like an object. You can use the name of a function. So if you look up here, I've got, here I'm creating an anonymous function, right? That's what this arrow function syntax is. It creates a function as an object that doesn't have a name. It's just a value that is a function. But I take the value of that function definition and assign it to this variable. And now I can use that variable because its type is function. I can use that variable with the parentheses and call it like a function because it is, you know, the value of it is a function that's been defined. Okay. So add number itself, just by using the name add number as a variable, that references the function that it contains, the value of the function, not the return of the function, but the value of the function definition itself. So here I'm just using add number. Remember, in whenever we're in JSX, anytime we want to reference a variable or anything that's not part of JSX, we've got to put it, you know, with the regular JavaScript, we've got to put it in curly braces. So that's why the curly braces are there. And then we just put the variable name. And so what we're actually passing into the counter button as a member of this properties object is like this. It's got a property itself called number function that is a function. And what that means is that we can use that number function any place a function would exist, including in our click handler. Because remember, when we define a click handler, we just define a function that executes, right? So in this case, we're able to take the function that gets passed in and use it as the click handler for a regular button element. That allows whoever's creating our custom button to decide what function gets executed when our custom button's button element gets clicked. When they could do anything else with it, they could actually call that function if they wanted. It would make this particular thing impure. It would be something they would probably want to do as part of an effect. That's a different topic. We talked about that last time. But hopefully this is making sense. Parameter passing or property passing is nothing more than just plain JavaScript. So your component function is just a function, and it can receive properties. And the way that it gets those properties is property names that are set in the opening tag when that component is used in JSX somewhere else. And they're just all bundled together in an object. And so we reference them like this, okay? So it might have been a little confusing in that, you know, right here, when this gets executed, it's actually calling a function that is defined somewhere else. And in this case, it's defined as part of our counter component. Okay, but that's actually what we wanted to have happen, so that when I click this button, it calls a function that's defined in its enclosing parent, and what that function does is changes the state of the enclosing parent, which is bound to this this text here. We can see that right here. Okay, so when I click this button, it's going to call the function in the parent component, which increases this count variable. And because we're declarative, when the data changes, React automatically changes the you know, how it looks, and that's going to get that's how that's going to work. That's about all the time I could really take on that, but I hope I've simplified that for you, because it really isn't any more complicated than that. When you hear about something like something called prop drilling, all that really means is when you have a grandparent component that passes a property to one of its children, only for the purpose of having that child pass it again to one of its children. That's what's known as prop drilling. And so it's a pattern that you can really get into trouble if it gets out of hand. It's really complicated, and you can create a lot of really weird bugs, and it also makes the code really unreadable in some instances. But that's why they call it prop drilling. It's just taking a property that's defined from a parent component on a child component, so that the child component can take that property and then just reuse it in one of its children components. In some cases, you could go on, down, down, and down, and down. And there are ways to be able to share information from upper level components to lower level components without doing prop drilling that are far more elegant and safe and easier to debug and make better code. I mentioned those in the notes from the last class. If you read through those, you'll find it somewhere in there where I talk about prop drilling as a pattern. And there are a couple of different methods, including the context API or hook in React, as well as Redux, which is something you'll learn about in the advanced JavaScript or advanced React class. Okay, so hopefully that clarified it and makes sense. Let me see if there are any questions or comments. Nothing in Slido. I think we've got things covered over there. Okay, so thanks, Winnie, for the suggestion. I will make sure that this code gets. This is actually one that I've shared before, but I'll share it again after I make sure that everything still runs with what I've done there. Okay. All right. So now let's get on to what we're going to talk about tonight, and we're going to start with. And my breaks tonight are going to be a little bit shorter, guys, because I needed to take time to go over that, and we are going to be a little bit short on time, but we will have a couple of breaks. So in about 15 minutes or so, we'll take a 3-minute break. We're going to start by at the terminal, and I apologize, I've got some blue text there that might be kind of hard to read, but it doesn't really matter. I'm just in a folder. So we're going to talk about how to create a React application, okay? In order for this to work, there's some prerequisites. In particular, you need to have Node.js installed, which will install by default another package called NPM, which stands for Node Package Manager. And basically what NPM is it's a package manager that allows you to install packages either globally so that every Node application or JavaScript application can access them, or locally to a particular project. And it allows us to manage dependencies that are needed for a particular project. So once you've got Node installed and NPM installed, there's another package that you can install using NPM called Yarn. Yarn is a replacement for NPM. It's kind of funny that you would use NPM to install it, but that's how you get it. And it actually uses NPM in a lot of ways, but it makes some particular things about NPM easier to do. I'm not going to dive into that. You can read about that online. I prefer Yarn, so that's what I use. But in all of the examples that we have tonight, you know, you can see the NPM compatible command for that, and I'll make sure that you have access to that as well. So we're going to use Yarn, and essentially what we want to do in order to be able to create React applications is we want to install a package either using NPM or using Yarn called Create React App. Okay, and what this package does is it allows us to create a React application with all of its dependencies in place without us having to hand code everything. And so we're going to do that, and then we'll go through the anatomy of what it creates so that you understand that. And then we'll be able to look at that in Code Sandbox and see how it lines up. Okay, so if you've got Yarn installed, then you could do Yarn global add create React app. Okay, that's the syntax. So I'm just at a prompt, a terminal prompt on my Mac, and you would do this at a command prompt on Windows with Yarn installed. Global means that we want this application installed in our global package cache or repository, so that it's available everywhere instead of within, you know, from a particular directory. Add means that we're adding the package, and then this is just a package name. And what Yarn is going to do through NPM is it's going to reach out to one of a number of different NPM servers that have access to the Create React application, and can download it. So it's essentially going to download it for you, and then make it so that you can execute it. So I'm going to do this, but because I already have it installed, it's going to run pretty quickly. Okay, it says I'm done in 1.94 seconds. If you don't have Create React App installed, one of the things that Yarn and NPM do for you is it will determine what dependencies the package you're trying to download, what dependencies it has. And in the case of Create React App, there are a lot of dependencies. It depends on something called Babel. It depends on something called Webpack. And those things themselves have dependencies. And so this is, when we say it's a package dependency manager, that's what it's going to do, is basically create the dependency tree and download everything that you need in order for Create React App and all the things it uses and all the things those things use. It'll download all of them for you. And if you've not done it, it can take a few minutes. Okay, so like I said, for me it went pretty quick because I already had it installed. But hopefully you're running it, and by the time we get to moving on, you'll have it ready to go. Okay, the NPM version of that command is NPM. Let's see, I think it's. Give me just a second. I use the shortened syntax, and I want to say it's -i-g, so -g for global and -i for install. So you would do -i, someone correct me if I got this wrong, -g, and then create React app, and then that should try to, yeah, so I've missed something. It says npm install, so let me redo that. So it's not -i, this is the command. Okay, or just I. And the G is again global, and it's going to try to do the same thing, and it's checking all of my modules to make sure I've got everything, all the dependencies that are needed. You can see one of the reasons why I like Yarn is it's much faster. It took a couple of seconds. In this case, for NPM, it took almost 11. I'm not getting any younger, so I don't like wasting time. So that's that's why. But so that's the command to, if you prefer to use NPM or if you don't have Yarn installed. Okay, so that's our first step, is to get Create React App installed. Now that we've got it installed, we can use it to create a React application. Okay, and so the way that you do that is you just call the name of the package, Create React App, and then you give a project name, which is essentially going to become a folder name, right? I'm just going to call it new app because I'm not very creative when it comes to that kind of thing. Okay, so what this is going to do is it's going to kick off a process. Maybe I do have, yeah, I do have new app. Let's create a different one. Create React App, my fancy app. Okay, so now it says it's creating a new one, and it tells me the folder it's creating it in, and it's going to go through the process of downloading everything that's needed, and this is also going to take a few minutes. Okay, so someone's asking a question about Git. I don't want to muddy our conversation with talking about that because it'll be a little bit of a rabbit hole for us. If you're familiar with Git, then if you've got a repo that you've already created and you've got it locally, then you can create the React application in your Git folder, and then and then you can push it back up to your repo. So that's the short answer for that, but I'm not going to dive into that. But I'll see if I can add some additional notes around Git integration for you. But yeah, so you can do Create React App into a Git repo. Typically, yeah, so that's how you do that. So you can see this is going to take a little bit of time. I'm going to create a new terminal and make it a little bigger so we can see. Let's see, what do I want to call this? Learn. learn React. Okay, so you can see that my fancy app has been created, and there are things that are happening. If I go into Node modules, you can see there's a bunch of stuff that's already been downloaded, and more will even come. Okay, so all of these things are things that are dependencies and sub-dependencies. Okay, so that while that's going, we will continue on and talk a little bit about the anatomy of a React application. I'm going to use an existing one. We'll just use this new app to take a look at it. Okay, so a couple things to notice here are some folders. We've got anything with a D here is a folder. If you're interested, it means directory. So there's a source folder, then there's a public folder, and then there's a node modules folder. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to load Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to point it to the current directory, the one that I'm in, so that it loads up with that. Okay, then let me, that's probably a little too big. Let me know if that's, let me know if you can see that, or if you can't, rather. Yeah, well, this one's not fresh because I already modified things in it, but we'll go through the anatomy as soon as that other one is done. Oh, that's not what I want. Let me go to my terminal and take a peek at. Yeah, so this is still going. Okay. One of the folders it creates is called public, and inside public is where we put our index.html file, and it creates one for us. If we open it, you can see what it has, and it's very similar to what we've seen in Code Sandbox, where it creates a div that has an ID, so that in our index.js file, we can mount our main custom component to that. So we get that by ID using native DOM functions, and then we use that in the React DOM.render in order to mount our component into the DOM tree at that location. Okay, so this is all set up by Create React App by default. So that's what's in the public folder, and then it creates a folder called source, and in here is where you get your index.js file, and I've modified this one from the default. But essentially, this will have the React and React DOM and app components referenced, as well as our styles. It adds all this for you. And React and React DOM are dependencies for our application. And so when we do yarn add create React app, it downloads those packages for us. And when we run create React app, it downloads them into our node modules, right? So if we scroll down in the node modules folder, which contains all of the modules that this is going to depend on, and you can see why this would be a nightmare to try to set up by hand, right? You don't want to do that. It's all alphabetical, so we'll come down to the R's here, and you can see that we have the React and React DOM packages installed here, and each one of these has code and other things. If you ever want to see what it looks like, you can certainly open it and take a peek and see what it consists of. Okay. So that's, let me get this closed back down. So it creates, in our source file, it creates our styles, our index, and our app.js. And then in app.js, it's got a bunch of boilerplate stuff that actually creates a running React application that you can then go and delete what you need. If you looked at the TK videos, Gabriel that's the very first thing he does when he does create React app. Or if you create a new React application in Code Studio, he'll go into the app component and delete it because he intends to create a new one, right? That's the whole point. You start from there. Okay. Let's take a quick peek again. All right. So you can see we did our My Fancy app, And after it's finished doing what it's doing, it gives us some instructions. It tells us about some scripts that we're going to take a peek at. It knows that I used yarn, so it gives me instructions that are specific to what my environment is. And then it says that I can start by going into my fancy app and then typing yarn start. But what I'm going to do instead, because I don't always follow instructions, is I'm going to go into my fancy app and I'm going to open Visual Studio Code so we can take a peek at what's there. All right, so as I mentioned before, it's got the source folder, which has all of our things in it. In public, there's a number of other things. There's some logos, a manifest, and a fave icon, all of which might be part of what you need for your app, and you'll probably end up replacing those anyway, as well as your robots.tech to inform all the crawlers what they should do. And then in the source folder, we have our index.js, which is going to register our app in this location. We're not going to cover this. It's that is a squirrel right there. I'm not going to cover that today. We've got our index.css, which is specific to this application. We have our app.js, which has a div and some other stuff in it. And then that all gets mounted. And so now we can take a look at package.json. Okay, package.json is a package file or a JSON file that describes our application. So it talks about its name, its version. It defines what dependencies we have, and it also has a section that defines these scripts. And we're going to talk about those in just a second. And then there's a number of other sections that that it defines, and we're not going to dive into what they mean. You can get that information online, but for our purposes today, these are the things that really matter to us: the dependencies and these scripts. So the dependencies it takes care of for us, and it basically tells any environment that needs to know about managing our application what our dependencies are. So if I were to distribute this application without the node modules, without all of that big chunk of stuff that existed there, but I included this package.json file, then all somebody else would need to do is to execute the yarn command. And yarn would look in package.json, see what the dependencies are, and then go through the process of downloading everything that it needs to be downloaded into the node modules folder. Okay, so that's why these dependencies are important. There's a syntax that goes here in terms of defining what versions are acceptable to us. If we need an exact version, or if we need a range of versions, or if we need anything that's over a particular version, there's a syntax that goes into this, and we're not going to dive into that, but just understand that's what some of these characters mean and what they're doing there. One of the other packages that Create React App that is installed with Create React App is called React Scripts. React Scripts is an application that takes a command, and then based on that command, it'll take certain actions, okay? And so in our package.json file, we have the ability to define any script that we want. If I wanted to create a script, again, called dance, then I could give it some command that's going to get executed in the terminal. Okay, it's going to get executed in my operating system space. So I could take this command right here and actually run it at the terminal. So if I were to copy this and come here to the terminal, I could run it just like this. So the stuff that you find in, I'm not going to run it now because I want you to see me do it using the script itself. Anything you define as a script here is an instruction for yarn or for npm to execute this command in the terminal. Okay, and so we could put any command that we want there. And in this case, we've got a command to start, a command to build, a command to test, and a command to eject. Okay, so here inside Visual Studio, I'm going to open my terminal in here. It puts me in the same folder, my fancy app folder. And from here, I can issue the yarn command with the start script. So when I say yarn space and then a command, it's going to look in the scripts section of the package.json to see if there's a script that matches that command. And if there is, then it will execute this command for us. It's a little shorthand way of doing that. What React scripts is going to do when we do start is essentially it's going to transpile our React application. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a second. And then it's going to, after it transpiles it, it's going to package it using Webpack. And there's a number of other things that it does. It's fairly complicated or complex, not complicated, but complex. Then after it does that, what it will do is it will start a local HTML server, or HTTP server rather, pointed at our application. And it'll start it listening on port 3000. Okay, so when I run this, you'll see it go through the process. So you can see it's executed the React script start command. And React scripts is examining, it says it's starting the development server. One of the first things that it will do is launch a web page to localhost 3000. You can ignore what you see here because this is going to be refreshed here in just a minute. And then it says, you can now use it in this browser. It's also reachable across the network if I don't have a firewall that's blocking it. Okay. So here you can see the application that it is, and all it is a simple web page. It's got a link to it and so forth. Okay. Now, one of the things that that's nice about this environment, you can see it's still running here on my terminal, is that it supports something called hot loading. And what that means is that if I go into, let's say, app.js, and here in this paragraph tag, it says edit and save to reload, right? So it wants me to edit this file in order to reload. I want to change it to have a blast. Now, if I go back to my app, you can see it says edit source app.js and save to reload. What I'm going to do is, let's see. Let's minimize this. Okay. So you can see I've got my app here. I've modified it, and as soon as I save this file, so I'm just going to hit Alt or Command S. As soon as I save it, you can see that it's automatically reloaded my application over here, including my changes. And that's kind of a handy feature because as you're going, you can get real-time feedback on the changes that you're making and how they work. Okay. All right. So just to review, you want to have Node.js, which installs NPM automatically. So you need to install Node.js, which will install NPM. Optionally, you can install Yarn. Then using either NPM or Yarn, you need to install create React app. Then to create a React application, you just run create React app. And that will create this entire folder structure with all of this data in it, as well as all of the dependencies of the packages that we need. It'll take care of doing all of that for you, including defining these scripts so that you can immediately launch your new React application simply by calling React scripts start. Or even more conveniently, you can do yarn start or npm start. Note that if you have a custom script that's not one that has a well-known name like build, test, or start, then npm requires the run command. So you have to type npm run and then the name of the script, whereas yarn doesn't. You can just use whatever the script name is with yarn. But start is a well-known script name, and so both npm and yarn do not require the run keyword. So either yarn start or npm start. Yarn build or npm build will essentially compile or transpile our application and webpack it for production. So you can then deploy it to a server. It goes through a process called minifying as well. If you want to take a quick peek at what that looks like, let's go back to our terminal. And okay, so you can see the folders we have here: node modules, public, and source. If I did React scripts build, actually, React scripts is local. So if you're running a module that is not global, then you have to use npx. npx will run our module and then send it the build command. And essentially what it's going to do is it says it's creating an optimized production build. And it'll go through all the code that we have and transpile it into pure JavaScript, and then minify it and package it. Okay, so you can see that after it's gone through gzip, it creates these files that do not resemble at all our actual application. Okay, so if we look here now, we have a new folder called build. And then inside build, there's a number of different things, but one of the things is this folder called static. And then inside static is a JS folder. And inside JS, we have some map files, and we also have these JS files, right? So if I were to do code 2.f blah, blah, blah chunk JS and take a peek at it, you can see what we get here. Believe it or not, this is an actual working pure JavaScript application. You can see how big it is. It can, and exactly what it does is black magic to me, but you get kind of the idea. It's taken our huge application that we're developing and scrunched it down as much as it can be. And those map files will help us to do production debugging if we need to, because obviously this would be almost impossible to debug, right? So just to give you an idea, close this. Actually, what do I do? I want to close this file. Go back to our terminal. So that gives you an idea. And then the test command has to do with testing. We're not going to cover that tonight. And then the eject command, create React app, is actually obfuscating or hiding a lot of our configuration details from us. And when you execute the eject command, it makes all of those configuration details visible. And then you're now responsible for them. And it can't be undone once you do that. So be aware of that. But hopefully that's been helpful to understand how you can create a React application. I say from scratch, it's not really from scratch, but it's not using Code Sandbox or any other IDE that's web-based like that. And then you can use Visual Studio Code or whatever your favorite text editor is, Sublime or anything else to manage your application in your environment. Okay. Let's take a 3-minute break, and then we're going to go, we're going to dive into some other stuff pretty quickly. I'm actually hoping that our discussion about props is going to be helpful when we get there, but there's some other stuff that we need to cover, and we've got a lot to do tonight. So let me minimize these, and we'll get, actually, we'll do a 3-minute timer. So we'll have a couple of minutes. So take a quick break, get something to drink, stretch out a little bit, and then we'll be back here in just a minute. All right. All right. So let's take a peek at some of our questions here. I was not going through these before. Some of these might be a little old, but I'll just briefly go over them. Somebody asked, would you yarn global add create React app in the root of a folder? And with yarn, so when you type yarn global add create React app, that adds create React app to the global package cache, okay, which is available to npm and yarn from anywhere. And so it doesn't matter where you are when you do that. There's a location where global packages are installed and stored. It's managed by the operating system in the package manager, and that's all that does. So it doesn't matter where you are when you install create React app. It's added to the global cache. If you type yarn add and then the name of a package, like we're going to in a little bit, then it adds that package to that directory that you're in. So when you're doing global, it doesn't matter where you're at. Somebody else said they got the permission denied errors. Please reach out to your TL for help with that. Say briefly why you prefer yarn and not npm. Me personally, there's a number of different design reasons. There are problems with npm that they say that they undertook to resolve. A lot of those problems are not problems I've ever encountered, but I personally like its speed and I like the simplistic syntax. So it's just a personal preference, but they both do the same thing. So it's not a strong preference. I wouldn't leave a job over it, but it's just my preference. Somebody asked, do we download that from Get Bash? I'm not sure I understand that question. You might want to rephrase that. I'm not sure, and it might have been in context of something that's passed. I had to use sudo to install create React app. If you've got limited permissions, then you may have to do that. That's just a matter of getting elevated permissions so that you can install. Somebody else asked, why not npx create React app, my fancy app? If create React app is installed globally, then npx is not necessary. npx is what you do if you need to run a package from the local cache and node modules. But because I installed create React app globally, I didn't need to use npx. Can we change package.json? And if yes, what can we change? We talked about the scripts. And then other information in package.json that you can modify include, let's see, all of this information, the name, the version, dependencies. I wouldn't manage that by hand. I would let yarn and npm manage this section. But you can also create the scripts. And then there are other sections that you can create. It's got a very deep syntax and things that you can do, so you can check into that. Somebody asks, if you globally install Axios or styled components, do you still need to add them individually to each project as well? And you do. They need to be added as a dependency. That's how they end up here. Right, so you do need to add them. In addition to that, the packaging applications like Webpack and things need to have access to them. Okay, let me clear these questions. How do you get the fancy icons by your file name? So these icons are part of an extension that I installed. I can't remember which one it's called. Let's see. VS Code icons. It's just an extension that I installed. And there's several extensions you can use that do icons there. All right, let's continue on then. All right, so we've got this application called My Fancy App, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the app.js file, and I'm going to take everything out of here. Okay. Now we know how to create. In fact, I'm going to take logo out because I don't need that. We know how to create, right? And if I look at my index.js, then we're getting our root element and it's mounting in the right place. So this is all fine. I don't need to worry about this anymore. Our CSS, I'm actually going to empty. We'll talk about why in just a minute. And then our package.json, I messed around with the scripts, but I'll save that. Okay. Let's close all of these. Okay, I don't need this. Let's see. Command delete. I don't need that one. We're not worrying about tests. And I don't need this logo. I don't need that README file, just to clean things up a little bit. And if I look at my public, I'm not going to mess with any of this. We'll just leave it there. As long as I close it, then I'm fine. Actually, I guess I needed that logo file. Let's take a peek at our index file here. And see if we can figure out why we need that. All right. Logo.svg. Okay. Close this. I think we should be fine. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so now it's looking for app.css. I don't need that. And now we're compiling. Okay. So it says React is defined, but it's never used, which is true because I'm not defining anything here. So I've got my application compiling, but it's not actually doing anything. All right, so we know how to create you know, a component here. I could do like that. And then if I compile that, then I need to find my, I'm actually going to minimize these, and we'll take this and scrunch it over a little bit so that I can see my application. Okay. All right. So now we've got this application still working. I've got a button that doesn't do anything. So we know how to do this. We're going to take a look at a component library that gives us access to a number of different components that let's see. Okay, it's called React Strap, and essentially what React Strap does is it takes a CSS library called Bootstrap, and it creates a library of components using the styling from Bootstrap. Okay, so in order to understand React Strap, we need to take a peek at Bootstrap. Okay, and all Bootstrap is CSS. Right, that's all that comes with it. And through the magic of CSS, it allows us to have access to number of different capabilities. So it automatically styles things like buttons that have certain properties, and grids, and boxes that have certain capabilities and properties in them. And all of this stuff is built into Bootstrap CSS, and then all that React does is it takes that Bootstrap styling and then turns it into just going to get some muting here. It turns it into components that we can use. Okay, so we're gonna use that, and in order to use that, we need to first let me go to the React main page. We need to install it. Okay, so here's the command for npm. We're not installing it globally. If you take this command and execute it, it will add React. It also tells you to add React and React DOM. We don't need to do those because we already have them. But it'll add React to your node modules folder so that it's available to your local application. So I'm going to come back to my terminal. And let's see. Okay, so in my fancy app folder, let me change this to, I don't know if I can change the color to, I didn't even think about making it white. I'll look into doing that in the next break. But from here, I just want to do yarn add and React strap. Okay, but we also need to have Bootstrap. Bootstrap's not technically JavaScript, it's just a CSS file, which is why we need to add it separately, because it doesn't really show up as a dependency. But we want to get that package installed on our local application. Okay, so this will take a little bit of time, but what this is going to do is add those packages to our local repository, our local package folder, so that from in here we can now use them. So if we go back to our documentation, once we've got it done, we need to import the Bootstrap CSS, and then we can import individual components from React Strap. Okay, so we'll first take this line here and come back over to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to do this in index.js. Okay, so that's going to bring that in, and then we can import like a button or other components. We're going to start with the button into our app component. Okay, so now instead of a regular button like this, we can reference this component that comes in from React Strap. Okay, so if I save this, we can take a peek at, that's the wrong one. We can take a peek at the button now. You can see it's got some styling on it. It's a little bit different. When I click on it or hover over it, it's got some animations and things that are automatically added to it. And I didn't have to do anything to add any of that stuff. That just comes by default. Okay. So that's a real simple example of how to create a component using using React Strap, and it's taking advantage of the Bootstrap CSS. So the question is, what did I import in index.js? And again, I got these right off of the documentation page, the front page for React Strap. I did this import here in the index.js file. And this is importing the Bootstrap CSS, which exists locally. It's inside our node modules folder, and it brings it in. And then we did this import in the app.js file to be able to access the button function, really, or the button component from within React Strap. Okay. All right, so it looks like there's some zoom in. Okay, am I zooming in here? I can do that. Hopefully that'll help. All right, so that gets us this this application or this button running the way that it is. What I want to do now, and I'm hoping I can go through this pretty quickly and that you'll be able to follow along, because again, all we have to do to access components that exist in the React Strap component library is import them by name. This is a named import. If we look at the documentation for React Strap, there's a whole list of components that are available, including one called card, which we're familiar with, right? It's got a number of different components that we can access to manufacture a card, and all we have to do is import them by name from React Strap, just like we did the button right here. Remember before we talked about the ability to do multiple named imports inside the curly braces just by separating them with commas, okay? So just really quickly, and we're going to dive into this a little more deeply by moving over to Code Sandbox here in a minute, but I just want to demonstrate how we would go about creating you know, a card application using React Strap, okay? So if we were to go, in fact, I'm just going to take this and I'm going to copy it. Actually, might as well get the whole thing. And then we'll, let's see, we'll come back over to this application. And what I'm going to do is create a new component file, and I'll call it, just call it card component. And in my card component, I know I need to import React. Okay, and then I know that I need to export by default. I'll call it, it's a function, we'll call it card component. We'll add a properties parameter just in case. And then we'll add this return statement, okay? The problem that I have here now is that I'm accessing these components, but I haven't imported them yet. So I'm going to go back to my documentation, and I'm just going to make it easy on myself by copying this and pasting it, okay? You'll notice that there's one element that we're not using here, and I'm going to leave it there because I'm a little bit lazy right now. So I'm importing all of these components from React Strap, and then here in my component, I'm returning it, them, right? And there's not much to this. It's just a really simple card. And then if I were to go back then to my app.js, let me save this. I'll go back to app.js. And instead of returning a button, I can return card component, okay? But in order to do that, I need to choose card component.js and import my component from that file, okay? It doesn't like button in card component. That's because I have this button here, but I'm not importing button there. Okay. So we can see here that now we've got a card that's coming in. It has an image that's not really anything, right? It's a broken image right now, but you can see what happens there. And really quickly, I'm going to, well, actually, we're going to take a little bit of time and talk about layouts here with this, because I think that this will be, you'll find this to be important, and we're going to use it when we get back over to Code Sandbox. Okay, if I were to take this card and just duplicate it, then you'll see what we get over here is just one after the other, after the other, after the other. Okay, and it might not be quite what I'm interested in. Maybe I want a layout similar to a Flexbox, where like we've in some of the applications we've been writing and working with, where it works like that, right? So React Strap has the ability to do that through what it is called a layout. But really, all the layout is a wrapper around the Bootstrap grid. In fact, I'm actually just going to go to layout here. Actually, I'll just come to this grid system. I'm not sure. I'll put this link in. What did I get here? I'll drop this link for you guys so you can go and look at it as well, because we're going to refer back to this in just a minute. But React Strap gives us 3 different components that we can use to create a layout. There's a container, a row, and a column. Okay, and then there's some properties that we can pass in particular to the columns, that will control how the layout works. It's based on a Flexbox in CSS. Okay, but what we're going to do is switch back over here, and if we look at this, we're putting everything in a div, right? But what we want to do is, and I'm just going to do another import just because I want to keep these a little bit separate just to help out. We're going to import container, a row, and a column from React Strap. And what that will allow us to do is create a container instead of a div. We'll come down here to the bottom. Container, let me get rid of this and this so you can see a little easier. So now that we have the container, inside the container we want to create a row. And then we want to close that off down here. And then inside the row we want to create a column. And that's where we're going to put our cards, okay? So similar to a Flexbox, if you're not familiar with a Flexbox, it's something worth learning about. And then we'll take, let's take all of this. And then we'll take all of these cards and we'll indent them as well. Okay, so what essentially it's going to do is it's going to create a row, and it'll allow us to put elements in that row, and then it uses an automatic algorithm to determine when it needs to start a new row. Okay, so it's going to flow in that direction for us. Okay, so if I save this, and then look over here, you'll notice that we still have essentially the same sort of thing, right? So there's a thing that we want to do in our column, and that is indicate, and I'm going to go over what this is in just a minute. So the React must be in scope means you need to import React. Okay. So what this will do is it creates our cards for us, and then for each one of them, and let me look at my code here and see what I've got. I'm missing something. Let's do. It's container, row, column, and then the cards inside. Okay, we'll get a chance to take a closer peek at this when we go, but you can see the idea here is that it allows us to try to create a kind of a flow, and it's not rendering the way that I expected it to, but we'll look at that when we get a little further on, because we still have a lot to cover, taking a little bit too long on this. But the idea behind this, when we look at this flow, the way that the Bootstrap system works, this is the one that I want here, is that for any given container, whether it's a container element or a column element, or rather a row element, it's broken up into 12 components. So whatever the width is, it's broken up into 12 equal components. We can call them columns, right? What we can do with these properties, let's see, where do I get down to? Yeah, we have different properties that allow us to specify how wide, how many of these components that particular column should take. Okay, so in my code here, I'm saying that for extra small screens, I want that thing to take up the entire width, all 12 columns. Whereas for extra large screens, I only want it to take up 4 columns, and that's where it should flow over to another column, a visual column that's the next 4 columns and then the next 4. So I should be able to get 3 cards before it flows to the next row, because each card should take up 4 of the 12 slots, and then the next 4, and then the next 4, and then it'll go down to the next one. And Bootstrap is responsive in that it allows me to define what that experience should look like based on the screen size. So if we look at the documentation, for screens that are less than 576 pixels wide, we can specify, a class that has a particular number on it, like this, with the -4, but we're not actually using that because we're using React Strap. This is the syntax that it uses. It takes a property and it says for the extra small screen, make it 12, and for the extra large, make it 4. If we were to go back over here and look at the content here, we can see that our div has these 2 classes on it, call-12 and call-xl-4. Okay, so our syntax here of xs equals 12 and xl equals 4 is translated into these class names that are for Bootstrap. Okay, and so that's what, what you'll notice is that when I'm down to a certain size, these take up the full width, but when I get to a larger size, then they only take up part of it. Okay, a fourth of it, or yeah, a third of it. And that's because it's detecting that it needs to use Bootstrap CSS for the larger sizes. That's what makes it responsive, which means it'll flow properly on smaller screens than as well as on larger screens. That was probably more confusing than it needed to be. We're going to look at it again when we get into Code Studio, but hopefully the main gist that you're getting is that we do have the ability to manage layouts, and we can create components, and this is all coming from React Strap. We're importing these components from React Strap. React Strap is exporting these components the same way we've exported them. When we create our own custom components and we put them in a file and we do, this, that's exactly what the React Strap system is doing. And then how we're able to pass in properties to our own components and then use them to control what the component looks like, that's exactly what React Strap is doing, right? So when we specify these properties in their component function, they've got a props parameter. Maybe it's called props, it could be called banana, who knows? But whatever it's called, they're accessing these parameters that we're passing in, these properties, and using it to render the actual elements through React.js. And that's why we end up with these things. Okay, that in the div. All right. So that's a brief introduction to React Strap. And now what we're going to do is use it to modify a project that we worked on before, our Ghibli Studios project. Okay, so let me go back into here, code, and open up my terminal and press Control-C to stop what was running there. Okay, and then I'm going to put this away. And I'll bring in this, and then we'll drop the link to you guys so that you can use it. Okay, so if you want to follow this and open this and follow along, you can. These principles are pretty straightforward, so you know, I should be able to go pretty quickly, and it should make sense to you. Let me see if there's any questions. No questions, so we're going to be able to dive into this now. All right, so what we're going to do here is essentially what we just did. We're going to use React Strap to recreate these cards. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to add a dependency for React Strap, and then also for Bootstrap. Okay, and then once we have those dependencies, we need to add them to our application. So if we come into here, we can we need to import the Bootstrap CSS. And that will make it so that all of the Bootstrap CSS is usable. And then we also need to, when we get to it, we'll need to import individual components, okay? The next thing I want to do is I'm going to pretty much gut my CSS because we're using the styling that comes with React Strap. So basically everything below the root element or the root selector in this styles.css, I just deleted it. Okay. And then index, we've got our import for Bootstrap, and you'll notice it really horked our thing. You know, we no longer have cards, right? Because that styling was what was helping us to create the cards. Okay. The next thing we want to do is we want to take a look at movie card. Okay, so this is where our card is created. And so from here, this is where we want to, you know, basically import we want to import the elements that we want to use to create the card. And those elements are going to be named imports, and they're card text, card body, card title. We'll also add a card image. Okay. Okay, so I got these component names off of the React Strap documentation. Okay, so if we were again look at the components, if we come into card, then here's where I got them from. Okay, so just by looking at this, I was able to discern what elements are available to me, and there's some experimentation I can figure out, you know, what I need to do with them. So I know I want to use these. I've got my default export, but I'm going to create another function called movie card 2 with properties, and I'm going to try to recreate what we had as our card before. Okay, so that consisted of we know we're going to need a card component, And I'm going to go ahead and add, just for kicks, an image component. Okay. And we'll take a look at what we want to do with that in a minute. And then after the image, we want to add the card body. Inside the card body is where we're going to put the card title. And then below the card title, we'll have some text. And then that should be what makes up our card. So in terms of looking at how to duplicate this, we know that our card title is going to come from our properties, right? So before, we grabbed it from props.title. And then the text was this props description. Okay. Now, what we want to do is return this. And then if we were to export this, and call it movie card, I'll keep this old one just in case. Then we can see we get something a little bit different now, right? So we're getting these cards. They're not lining up the way that we'd like. We've got a card image that doesn't actually have anything in it, that's in there somewhere, but doesn't display the broken image for us. But we've got the title, we've got our text. And so basically what we've done is we've replaced the div and HT2 and P elements that we were returning with these elements from React Strap. That gives us the benefit of the styling that comes with React Strap, you know, and other things that we can do with that. So that's essentially how we do that. Now we can add the ability to, you know, to get the flow that we want. And the way that that works is, let's see, where am I at? Okay. So we want to do the layout piece, right? As I think about it, when I look at my movie list, this is really where the container and the row should be, right? Because we only want one container and one row, whereas in the card, we want several columns that are created. So in the card, we're going to create columns, but here in movie list, we're going to create the container and the row. And if this works the way that it did every time I tried it before now, we should see it flow. But in order for this to work, we need to import container and row from React Strap. Okay, and then instead of this div, in fact, what I'm going to do is take this and duplicate it, and then I'll just comment out the rest of this so we can kind of refer back to it. We're going to take this div that is our wrapper right now, and we're going to replace it with a container. And then inside that, we'll create a row. Okay. All right, so that now that we've got that, we want to go back over to our movie card, and we're going to encapsulate this entire card thing with the column. But you'll notice that we're not importing column, so I'm just going to add that to my list here. So we'll save that. We'll save that. Now you can see we get our columns. Okay. There's obviously some additional styling that we can do. You know, for example, if we wanted, we can, you know, add an image to these. As I mentioned, I'm going to kind of cut that short, but I'll make sure to include it in the notes so that you'll see what that code looks like. But it should make sense to you because we're just, you know, basically going through the same process of just importing components and then using them, right? It's no different than us creating our own components and then importing them and using them. It's just that we're using them from React Strap, and then we've added this flow capability to it. Okay, and because in our card, our column doesn't have a flow, we can add one to it, or it doesn't have a column size. We'll add one to it and then see how that impacts. Yeah, so we'll get 4 columns out of that. Is how that works, and you can see how it's changing the flow there. It's certainly not as pretty as it was. There's more styling that we can do, but all of that styling can come through React Strap. Okay. Hopefully you guys are catching on to this and the power of it. There's some other aspects to React Strap, but this is basically, you know, it's a component library that we can use in that way. I'm going to shift gears and move over to another component library that we can use. Let me see if there's any questions. Nothing in Slido. And in order to do this, we're going to use let's see. Code Sandbox. I've got another project. And it's one that we should be familiar with as well. It was this this dog project, right? Okay, that has a couple of buttons. And all we're going to do here is just replace these buttons using this other component library. But there's some special things about this component library that I want to focus on with respect to you being able to have control over CSS. And what we're going to be looking at is something that is broadly referred to in the industry as CSS in JavaScript. So it's the ability to take, if you've ever had the thought as we were creating these components, essentially creating collections that ultimately in their heart were just collections of HTML elements that we could then reuse as components. If you ever had the thought, well, I wonder if I could do that with CSS styles, with styles. The answer is yes, you can. Whether or not you should, whether or not it's a good idea, is a hotly contested thing. It's a matter of personal preference for a lot of people. Again, tonight my main focus is to teach you how to do it, because you may need to know that for a job or a job interview, and so forth. So we're going to look at another package that is called styled components. And essentially what this allows us to do, and I've dropped the link to the Code Sandbox in Slack. Okay, but essentially what this allows us to do is to create reusable CSS in our JavaScript. One of the things that this can do for you is it can help you to separate your thinking from the cascading part of the cascading style sheets and localize what your styling is doing for the component that you're creating or that it's in. And so it kind of abstracts that thinking and allows you to keep it local, keep the styling local to the component itself. Okay, so let's take a look at this application. We've got a pet grid and a pet card. And if we look at the pet grid, if you'll remember on this one, we've got a couple of buttons. And each of these buttons changes the the state so that we load a collection of images that match that particular breed. I'm just going to use this um, as an example of this package called styled components. Okay, so we're going to add this as a dependency. If this were being done from our terminal, it would be yarn add styled components, or npm install styled components. Okay. But we've added it as a dependency here, and what that means is that we can now import it. Okay, we're just going to create a variable called styled that we're importing from styled components. Now, if we look at the documentation for this, there's a particular aspect of JavaScript that they use in order to make readable CSS in our code. If you're like me, when we were doing before, we were trying to add styling to our own components or to the default components in line. It's difficult to read, and some of the styling that we need to do is can be really involved. And if you try to do that in line, it just becomes intractable and really difficult to read. Here we're using a syntax that's part of the new ES6 standard that's called, oh, the name has just escaped me, template literal tags. Okay, so they're tags that are using template literals. And it's essentially, this is a method that this has nothing to do with styled components as a package. This is just part of JavaScript, part of the ES6 version of JavaScript. And if you want to learn more about it, then Google that, template. I can't know, I'm drawing a blank on this. I keep wanting to say template inline, but it's template literal tags. And if you look at that, you can find a lot of information around exactly how this works, and there's some pretty cool examples out there. But if you look at this, if you see this kind of syntax, what this should tell you is that the styled.button component is a function. Okay, so if we were to take this code as an example and put it in our code here, okay, this would not be unlike doing something like this. Okay, where we would pass some stuff in, some parameters in to this function call. These are essentially the same thing. Okay, it just is a different syntax that allows us to use a template literal to pass this data in, and it gets converted into parameters. Essentially, it gets converted into an array of parameters and parameter values. So each one of these, this actually gets, anyway, so that's essentially how that happens. And because it's a function, it returns a value that we can assign then to this. And what that value is a component, right? So we get a component that we can then use. And if you remember, components are just functions themselves. So what we know is that this is actually returning a function, and this is a function because we're passing parameters into it using this special syntax. Okay. What the syntax allows you to do, we'll get into this a little bit here. I'm going to do give you an example. And I just copy and pasted this. There's a lot of typing. I'll put this in. Oops. So the question is, button is a method called on the styled object. That is absolutely correct. You absolutely got it. Okay. Button is a method on the styled object, and the styled object, we got it from the import here. And this ability to pass parameters using this syntax allows us to keep the parameters in a readable fashion. We can read it and reason about it like we do regular CSS because of the way we're passing it in here. Okay. All right, so I've got this new button called a dog button, and I'm just going to run through this a little bit so we can understand it. And I'm not going to do anything fancy over here. I'm just going to add a couple of more buttons because we're short on time. But I think you'll be able to catch this from the notes as well when we go through this. And a lot of this is in the training kit as well. This should help you make sense out of the information that's there. And if you've got questions, now's the time to ask them. But essentially, we're passing in all of this CSS to this button function as a template literal, and then it's creating a component. So the styled module is creating a component that we're then assigning to our variable called dog button. And because I've created it as a component down here, I can use it like a component, right? So I could just do let's see. Yeah. Okay, now when I save that, what we'll get is 2 additional buttons here. Okay, but you'll notice that these top 2 have some properties to them. They're not hooked up. I don't have on-click event handlers. I can create them exactly in the same way here. In fact, if I wanted to, I could say on-click equals, and put it like this. Okay, and then likewise, I can take this on-click event handler and duplicate it. Right here, but instead of Mastiff, we'll make it Labrador. Okay, so now these are functional. I might have, yeah, I have it. So, but they have these other features to them, and what that is done by is with the CSS that we created, that we used when we created the component, when we passed it in. Okay, in particular, these 2 properties, the background and the color. Okay, so what's happening here is for the background color, we're passing in, like you would do in any template literal, we're reaching into the JavaScript world outside of the string and bringing in some expression, okay? And in this case, it's a function, okay? To make it a little more obvious that it's a function, I could do it like this, okay? And so it's a function that takes a parameter, and then the body of that function is returning the result of this trinary statement, which we'll talk about here in a sec. Okay, so there's a function that takes a parameter and then executes the statement. The question is, where does this parameter come from? Okay, so when there's a function here, what the styled components module does when it sees this is it calls that function and it passes in the properties that were set on that component. Okay, so we talked about this earlier at the very beginning, went through it in a very detailed manner, so hopefully you understand that any properties that we create here are going to be packaged up into an object that can be passed to the component. Okay, and so here we're creating a method that has access to the properties. Now, there's some magic that happens behind the scenes by styled components to actually take those properties and pass them into our function here. This is a function that we're creating. And so that's what this properties is. Now it's called props here. Again, we can call it whatever we want because this is just a function. This is just a parameter that has whatever name as long as we access it inside the function, right? So in this case, what we're doing is we're executing this ternary statement, which is basically a shortened form of an if-then-else statement, right? So everything before the question mark is a either truthy or falsy statement. We can do a comparison there. We can do any execute any statement that we need to that should result in something that's true or like true, or false or like false. Okay. So in terms of truthiness or falsiness, what does this statement here do? I'm going to change it back to props just because that's typical. Okay. So what does this statement, props.primary, by itself, what is that doing? So it's a statement that should either return a true or a false, we'll put it that way. How does props.primary return a true or a false? A couple of different ways that could happen. Okay, checks to see if it's an empty string. That's close. I don't know if an empty string is falsy or not. It may be. If that's the case, then it being an empty string could result to that. But you're in the neighborhood. Okay, checks whether the component has that property. Okay, more directly, it checks if this property exists on this object. Right. So props is just an object that gets passed into our function. And that object has properties on it that are made up of the properties that are defined here. So if it has, you'll notice that we create a property here, but we don't give it a value. This property doesn't have a value. So in the object that gets passed, it's going to have a property called primary, but the value of that property will be undefined. But what this is checking for is is primary itself undefined, or does it exist or not, right? And it turns out that it does exist. So this is going to evaluate to true for this component because we created it. For this component, it's going to evaluate to false because we didn't create it, we didn't add it on, right? So here we're using the existence of that property to make a decision, okay? So this is going to evaluate to a truthy value, and the decision is, if this is truthy, then return this value, and if it's not, return this entire thing is going to evaluate to one of these two values. By executing a function that we've created that will receive our properties, and that function is simply going to check for the existence of a particular property, and if it exists, it'll return white, and if it doesn't exist, it'll return this kind of chocolate brown color, okay? And so once it returns one of these two values, that becomes the value of this CSS statement. So background colon, ultimately, so if we were to open up our things here, we can look at this. Okay, and what you'll see here is that it's created a class that has this weird name. And in that class, if we were to look at it, in fact, we can see over here that the background color for that class is white for this button. Okay, if we were to look at the other button, then we can see its its class is DRIZ, and its background color is this, right? So it's done some magic behind the scenes to create classes out of our CSS here. But the value of the background property for those classes is defined by the result of our function, which is keying off of the property that gets passed here. And what this allows us to do is to create components that we can then reuse in other places or allow other developers to reuse that have that are usable, right? So we can just document it and say, if you want it to be white with a brown text, then define that property. That's all they have to do. And if you want it to be brown with white text, then just don't define the property, right? And all that magic happens here in our CSS when we have the component created, okay? A couple of other things you can do. We're a little bit over time. If you need to drop off, that's fine. You've got the recording, and I'll have some notes coming, but if you can stick around, we'll just take a quick peek at a couple other things that you can do here. One of the things that we can do is we can create a different version of this button and override some of these properties. We can do that by saying, or these CSS properties. We can do that by saying we want to define a new component. In fact, let's call it, and we'll call it white dog button equals styled dot, and instead of using their built-in component function called button, we can use our new component function called dog button. Okay, and then in here, let's say that we just want to change the background color. Maybe we want to force it to be white. In fact, that doesn't make sense to me why we would even do that. So let's, we'll call it a larger dog button. And in this case, maybe we just want to change the width and the height. That makes more sense. Okay. So here we can say, we'll make it 200 pixels by 60. That's not very reasonable. We'll save this, and then, what is it complaining about? I think I've messed this up somehow. I've gotten this wrong. I'm not doing this right. I think it's this way. Yeah, that's how it is. Okay, so what this does is it takes our other component and then we'll overwrite these things. So if I come in down here and instead of dog button, I say I want a larger dog button. Okay, then we get these two buttons, and notice that this larger dog button still inherits the hover capability. Okay, so the hover capability is doing the exact same thing that sets the background and the text color, only in reverse. So here we're saying if primary exists, make it white, otherwise make it brown. Here we're saying when you hover over it, if primary exists, make it brown. If it doesn't exist, make it white. That's why we're getting this behavior here. But notice that our larger dog button inherits all of that behavior from our existing or previous dog button. All we had to do was pass the new CSX in to change it the way we wanted to change it. Okay, any CSX property we can modify it and create a new version of a component. So you kind of get this hierarchy in a class-like object oriented like inheritance of these components, although it's not object orientation. Okay. All right. Let's see, any other questions? Nothing in there. That's the basic gist of it. Really what this boils down to, so we really dove into props. It took a big chunk of time, but I'm hoping that really cleared some things up, because that comes into play with these as well, and then so many other things, as well as just really clarifying and simplifying what React components are. They're nothing but objects that are defined as functions. When you call that function, it's going to return the object that React needs to do the rendering. And when React calls the function, React can pass data into that function, just like we can pass data into our own functions. The data that it passes in is data that's defined as properties as part of the opening tag, just like you would do with an HTML tag. And it's just an object that contains each of these different properties and whatever the value of those properties is. Right? Now you'll notice we're not using the onClick property up here. We could. I'm not sure how or why we would, but you can access anything that comes in props is available. It's just an object that has everything that was defined on the component when you created it. Okay. So with that in mind, we've looked at how to create a React application using Create React App. I dove into some details on that because nothing's worse than not knowing for creating confusion. So hopefully you've got some understanding of how that works. And my notes will detail that out pretty well as well. And then we took a look at two different component libraries, one called React that's based on the Bootstrap CSS. If you wanted to use Bootstrap by itself, you can. React just makes it easier to do in a React world. The classes that cause Bootstrap to do this kind of thing, if we were to look at this to create this kind of flow and grid pattern and other things that you can do, making it reactive, all of that stuff is available just as CSS classes. But I'm muted there. So you can use those CSS classes in React manually if you want, or you can use React which kind of encapsulates all of that for us. And then the styled components is another way to create components, but adding a more granular control over the CSS style using a syntax that allows it to be readable and easily maintainable by using this template literal tag syntax, which again is not real specific to styled components. It's part of JavaScript ES6, and plenty more you can learn about that because it's a really cool capability. But with that, we'll say good night. Appreciate the time. Looking for feedback from you. If you've got questions, please post them, and either in Slack, actually post them in Slack at this point because I'm going to close the Slido, and look for my notes to be coming a little later tonight. And that's all I've got for tonight. So you guys have a great night, and we'll catch you next week.